You're listening to Inside iOS Dev, show about real-world iOS development. Today with you, your host, Alex Bush. And today I have a story for you, a saga, a journey about hiding navigation bar on swipe and the bugs related to that. So basically what happened is something... this is something I've been working on lately at work, and essentially what happened with a new OS version, I think iOS 14.4 that was released relatively recently, a bug was introduced in the application I'm working on where, and it wasn't specific to actually 14.4, but for some reason it wasn't caught before and we didn't notice it before and users didn't complain about it. But basically what started to happen, there's application's a tab bar based application fundamentally, and there is in one of the tabs there's a navigation bar controller, and then there's a table view list in that view controller as the navigation controller as the root. And what happened, there was a library that we used, a third-party library that helps you set up, how is it called? Sort of a collapsible navigation bar on scroll. Essentially, the idea is that the behavior supposed to be, as the user, there's a list of items, list of cells displayed in that table view, and then there's a navigation bar at the top with filters, filter buttons and sorting buttons and all sorts of, and search bar to filter, search, and sort the list, right? And as the user starts to scroll down, right, so sort of swipe up, I guess, if that makes sense, and then scroll down the list, the navigation bar is supposed to gradually collapse into just the search bar. So roughly speaking, shrink half in size, right, and hide a bunch of elements for like sorting buttons and filtering buttons. And then as the user stops, right, scrolling, it still sort of persists and it's in collapsed state. And then as the user scrolls up, right, so back up to the top of the list, meaning the user swipes down, right, as the gesture, then the other way around, the nav bar is supposed to expand gradually as well, and instead of being just kind of increased twice the size into the original size and have all of the sort, filter, and other UI elements, buttons and UI elements in it. And it was working fine previously, but for some reason something changed, and I spent so much time on that bug trying to figure it out, and I could not pinpoint what exactly happened and what changed to cause the issue. But the behavior at the end of the day, there were two problems with it. So one was, as the user scrolls up and down the list, at some point somewhere, there was a content offset set, and it was done in the third-party library. So I had to debug rip the third-party library open and crack it open and just like go through everything in it. And it was actually pretty small. It was 2 Swift files. But there was a content offset set, and what I suspect there was, when the library would reset the content offset, it wouldn't do it right, and there would be some residual number of Y or height or whatever left in the content offset, and gradually the more you scroll the list up and down, the more that content offset would accumulate, eventually getting to the point where you're not able to scroll the list, right? Your content offset is so high, you drag down or up, it doesn't go anywhere. So there was that. And then there was another issue of scrolling getting stuck. And not sort of, how do I explain it? Not scrolling exactly, but because that's the, content offset eventually, a problem eventually would, get you to the stuck state. But the nav bar would stop expanding and collapsing, rather actually collapsing specifically. It would get stuck in the expanded state. So yeah, and the new view controller is pushed in the nav stack when you tap on one of the cells in the table view list. And then when you go back, tap the back button in the nav bar and go back to the table view, that list, the nav bar would get stuck in the expanded state. And as you scroll down, meaning swipe up, right, like before, it would collapse on that gesture and become, half the size and only have some elements visible. It wouldn't do that. It would just not stop doing that. And what I found out later was the reason for that, what was causing it, was the new view controller that was pushed onto the nav stack from when you select one of the items in the list. It had a flag hides... what was it called? I forgot exactly, but it's a hides nav and bar, or hides nav bars true. Basically, that's a iOS UI kit system flag that you can set on your view controller. And if you're in the tab bar context or tab bar application and your view controller has that flag and was pushed onto the nav stack, then when it's presented, the navigation bar for the tab bar controller at the bottom will be hidden. And when it's off the screen, then it's reversed, right? It's based on the view controller that's now top of the responder chain, right? So that specific thing, for some reason, again, previously it was not causing the issue, but now suddenly it does. So first thing that I was able to determine as I was kind of trying to reproduce that bug is that it was only happening on iOS versions 14 and up. So 14.0, 14.1, 0.3, I believe what I tested, and 0.4. All of them had the issue. And specifically it was due to... So the content offset I immediately turned off. It was the residual content offset. It was something that the library was doing, but also it was giving me an option to configure that if content offset should be sort of tracked, if you will, and then restored, as they say, and kind of disabling it, fixed it, and seemingly with no changed behavior, actually. It was kind of worked at before as intended. Again, I have no idea why that happened and how. Issue with the coming back to the list and the nav bar not collapsing upon scroll anymore. That definitely was caused by enabling that flag, right? So that hides tab bar flag set to true. If it wasn't set at all, then you can just push the new controller in the nav stack and go back, and everything's fine. And still the sort of the bar still collapses on scroll and then expands on scrolling up. Everything's fine. So I spent several days on it, unfortunately, trying to figure out and dig through the rabbit hole of that third-party library and figure out what's going on. And unfortunately, to be honest, I wasn't able to. I don't know what happened. My guess is that there is some height frame calculations that have changed in iOS 14 that essentially now kind of give the library different numbers and different values where before it wasn't, and specifically when the nav bar or tab bar is hidden on the newly pushed view controller, and I guess coming back from it causes some problems or each. Yeah, I don't really know. What I did find out though, that the library, first of all, one of the reasons probably why sort of a problem happened, the library wasn't updated since 2019, right? At this point, it's maybe not 2 years, but probably like a year and sometime, a year and a half. So it's been a while, right? It's not that well maintained, so likely, no one's, and it's not super popular, so no one caught it, right? And no one seen that issue. But another more fundamental problem that I figured is with the library, it basically, the way it would handle the collapsing of the nav bar was essentially by manipulating the height of the nav bar view, like navigation bar frame, and then manipulating the frames and the positioning and the height, or rather, sorry, I take it back. It was manipulating the Y position, as far as I recall, of the nav bar. So basically changing its frame, right? And then, and actually, and the height too. And then it would manipulate the frame of the view, sort of the container view that holds the table view controller, right? That holds the list. It would actually sort of, as much as it moves the nav bar up, that many pixels on the y-axis, it will also move the content view up as well. And this way, and then it animates the whole thing. And this way, it sort of gives you this illusion, if you will, right, of, well, navigation bar collapsing gradually. And it's not all bad, right? I've done a good job in the library of calculating the velocity and delta of the change and stuff like that. It was a bunch of not super complex math, but it was like this annoying stuff that you have to figure out with adding the gesture recognizer on top of your content view, your table view list, and then as you swipe, it figures out if your velocity of the swipe is like, if you flick and it's super big, I guess, and high velocity, then it collapses immediately. If you're like gently, slowly scrolling, it will only animate a little movement and the collapsement or expansion of the nav bar. Stuff like that, like little niceties, right? The library would take care of that. But fundamentally, that's the problem there. Fundamentally, it would rely on altering frames. And when you are in I sort of can confirm it kind of with high authority, I guess, in a sense, because I'm not that sort of specializing that much in the UI and layout stuff, and I'm not a great expert there. But from my experience, I suspect what happens is because of the auto layout system that's in place, sort of messing with frames is usually a bad idea if you have auto layout already, right? It's kind of conflicting. You go in too low level where you should really be manipulating the outer layout constraints in your animation blocks, and then everything's animated properly because then the system recalculates frames for you. If you then bypass that and ignore outer layout setup and constraints that you already have, and actually go ahead and mess with the frames yourself, which what the library was doing, then you kind of get into the trouble of, well, like what happened in my case, right? It would work for now, and it works fine because you accounted for all the cases and all the magical numbers of the height of the nav bar and stuff like that. But eventually some OS release, some new update might screw everything up for you, right? And now all of a sudden it just doesn't work overnight, right? Unless you maintain the library and kind of catch that sooner and test the library with the beta and GM master releases of the OS before it comes out and all that stuff. But that's like a lot of work to maintain that. So yeah, and basically as I kind of was digging through it and trying to figure it out and patch up that library, because that was my original idea. Let me find out, maybe there's some quirk here now with some offset content, something calculation. I'll just fix that and that's it. I can create a pull request for the library, fix it for myself, and then create a pull request for the library and kind of hopefully merge that. But unfortunately, I couldn't figure it out. I gave myself a time box of 2 days, and I was going nuts, to be honest, to be frank, and just going crazy with this, and couldn't crack it. What I ended up doing, right? So I started to research for alternatives. Okay, I really should be doing it with auto layout, first of all, somehow, if possible. Second, what are the other options besides that library? I couldn't find many other libraries that do that, and everyone keeps referring to, oh, look how Facebook or Instagram or one of those apps does it, and we're like, in our library, we're mimicking this behavior of collapsing navbar, blah, 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 blah. To my knowledge, in Facebook or Instagram, they never released that specific thing as a library. So we don't really know how they've done it, but most likely they have a bajillion of developers to maintain stuff like that and kind of sweat about those little things. And they probably just built something in-house, I would think. Either, again, based on the frames, which is fine if you have resources to maintain that and kind of watch for it, or maybe based on the outer layout constraints. Regardless, in my case, I'm actually in a team of 4 developers, 2 iOS, 2 Android, and including myself. So we don't really, basically 2 people on iOS. We don't really have resources to do that. So we have to rely on third-party libraries, right? Or native implementation. So in this case, I looked at the other library options. They were no better, honestly. And then they were like too invasive. Like this library already forced me to use a subclass of a navigation controller that they provided, and then sort of use it for those nav controllers where I want to have that behavior. And then it would force you to kind of call stuff, and the view will appear and view will disappear to kind of start tracking and untracking the swipe gesture to do the collapsing of the bar and tracking that. Stuff like it was kind of clunky. And other libraries would be sort of similar as far as I could assess. And then I thought, well, like, what else could you do? And then I stumbled upon actually native implementation. So Apple has this, let me check. It has this flag since iOS 8. So on the navigation controller you can call on the navigation controller a flag. You can set it to true. Flag called hides bars on swipe. So essentially, it does that. That's exactly what the library does. The user, you set the flag. You see your navigation controller expanded. Everything's fine. Then, as the user starts to swipe down, the nav bar would collapse, right, into a smaller sized version of it. And then as the user scrolls to the top, back up, it would expand it into a larger, taller, expanded version, right? But what this library, what this implementation doesn't do, and the library that I originally had does, it doesn't give you a notification callback to your own implementation, to your own list view controller, right, or table view controller, about the state navbar state change, right? It would not tell you that navbar collapsed or expanded, which is a problem because based on that callback from the third-party library, we were able to gradually sort of animate and collapse our own UI elements below the navbar for sorting, for filtering, stuff like that, right? Essentially, as far as we're concerned, we're quote unquote, this is quote unquote our navbar, right? The whole thing. But effectively, it's just a UI view container that contains a bunch of other views with those buttons for filtering and sorting. And then it sits right below the navbar that is implemented by navigation controller, right? The Apple's UI kit thing. So when I enabled that flag and I sort of disabled the third-party library, what happened? I got the behavior, but then of this collapse in the navbar, but only the navbar would collapse. It would kind of collapse 1/3 of it, if you will, visually, because it's the top, the navigation controller bar portion, and then our own custom view with filter and sort buttons part of it will not, right? It will just stay there. Then I started to research, well, how can I get a notification somehow from Apple? Because that's just kind of ridiculous if you think about it. You give us this functionality, but like that's obvious. That's like table stakes that you need to, for this feature, right? That you need to let the user of this thing know when the navbar collapsed or expanded. And they don't. I tried everything, and there's just nothing. There's no constraints. There's no anything. What I was able to dig out finally, Apple's implementation of this sort of hides bars on swipe thing in the navigation controller, they actually provide a few more properties that they sort of give us as public properties to be used. And one of them is actually called bar hides on swipe gesture recognizer. When you enable that hides bars on swipe flag, that recognizer now returns, there is a UI pen gesture recognizer created, and it actually returns you one. And what you can do, so that's a chance for me, right? And to at least have something. And I tried to figure out how to observe it, and basically what I was able to do, I could add I don't need to create my own pan gesture recognizer, and they actually explicitly say in the documentation that you should not replace it with your own. You should kind of, if you want to use it, use the one that UIKit gives you. And what I was able to do is to add a target to that recognizer, because your gesture recognizers actually can have multiple targets and actions attached to them. So I set the target to my own view controller, right? And then I gave it an action, which is basically an Objective-C enabled method, like you would give one to like IB action. And it was basically that method would be called and triggered every time when the swipe happens. When the user swipes up or down, that's what Apple's system kind of recognizes and looks for. And then essentially what it means, what I was hoping actually to get, I was hoping that through that gesture recognizer, through getting notifications on when the user interacts with the gesture or does the gesture effectively, I was hoping to get the state change, right? Like to actually get from Apple, oh, the navbar is now collapsed, or navbar is now expanded, or navbar is in the process of doing either or one of those. Unfortunately, they don't. What they return back to you, because it's just a target action, it's not a specific method, it's the generic target action, add target with action from just the super subclass of all of the gesture recognizers. So it really, in that method callback, it gives you the sender, which is UiPan gesture recognizer. But that type, that class doesn't have anything specific related to swiping the navbar because it's just a generic pan gesture recognizer. So the interesting thing I found out, though, as I would print the object's description, it actually had a property called state or navbar state, something like that, where it would say, oh, expanded or collapsed. It literally would say that. But it was in some private method. It was a private API, and only sort of the reason I saw it was exposed through that, I guess, localized descriptor or whatever it's called when, or description method when you print something out. So I had no choice in this case to try to infer and calculate, infer the state of the navbar being expanded or collapsed based on its height, or rather, sorry, not the height, but the origin of the navigation bar's frame. And basically, if it's going to be 0, that's when it's collapsed, or 0 or negative. I forgot actually. And if it's more than 0, right, it usually would be get to 44. Then that's the state of being expanded. And that's effectively how I sort of infer that. And that was kind of everything I needed. It's a bit clunky and kind of sort of, in a way, worse than that library that I was using. It would not give me gradual transition. I wouldn't get notifications sort of as the navbar starts to animate, so I can gradually animate my own UI piece. Yeah, so I had to basically subclass UI navigation controller myself as well, implement this target action on the gesture recognizer, and then notify my table view controller when this simply happens, and then infer expanded or collapsed state. And that's sort of my workaround and implementation on getting the navbar state. And then based on that state, right, I'm just returning a custom enum. If it's an expanded case, I then animate my own filter and sorting buttons and that UI piece and show it. And then if it's in collapsed state, I hide it and animate that. And actually, all in all, it's not as bad. It was slightly altered behavior from the original library where it was so super smooth and nice. Now it's not as good, and it's sort of more snappy than it used to be. And actually not even my part of determining, kind of crudely determining the expanded or collapsed state. Even if I don't do that, sort of Apple's own implementation on when they trigger the collapsement of the bar and like hiding it and then expanding it and showing it on the user's scroll up or down is kind of crude, to be honest. Like, it's not smooth. I was surprised. It's done, I feel like an afterthought. It just, yeah, again, just not smooth. It doesn't do transitions and in between states well. So yeah, that was sort of first part of my journey, and this episode's actually already longer than I expected. But the funny thing was, it was not the end of my journey with this bug, or rather, there was one of the bugs, right? So I quickly shipped this and as a new hotfix, and I rolled it out to all the users immediately. As soon as I had the fix. But remember what I told you, what I did. I subclassed a UI navigation controller, right? And everything was fine. And then I in my subclassing implementation, I actually have a new new protocol, scrolling navigation controller delegate that I created in my app. And I'm injecting that. So I have a custom initializer, and I, instead of only passing the root view controller like you normally would to a navigation controller when you create it in code, I am also passing as another param scrolling navbar delegate, and that's basically my table view controller, which will get the notifications about, the navbar being expanded or collapsed. Which is all good and all fine, right? Nothing wrong with it. But because I had to do this implementation, I also had to do the whole required init coder, decoder, and scoder thing and do the fatal error implementation that Xcode forces you to do when you have custom initializers on the UI view controller subclasses. I honestly don't know why they do that, for whatever internal usage reasons related to storyboard, I guess, and auto initializing stuff under the hood. But it was all working fine, and I tested it everywhere from iOS 13 to iOS 14.4, and everything was fine, right? Everything runs smoothly, everything works as expected, and I shipped it. But what happened the next day, I woke up to see a huge amount of bugs and crashes coming in, and crash rate increased 500% from what it was. And basically what happened, I was kind of shocked, right? Like, what did I do? What happened? I didn't do that bad of a job, I think, right? I didn't screw anything up, and I feel like I tested everything. But what it turned out to be, the initialization of that new subclass, scrolling navigation controller subclass, actually was crashing. And that was crashing the app upon launch, because upon launch of the app, if you're logged in, we'll load the tab bar controller, and then it loads all four view controllers for 4 tabs in it, and one of them was that scrolling navigation controller, that subclass that contains the list. And what was crashing, essentially, upon initialization, it was complaining that init with nib name and bundle initializer is not implemented. And it was crashing only on iOS 12 versions. I started to research, and I found out there is a bug in iOS, I think 11 to 12.5, or definitely in iOS 12, present in all the versions of it, where if you do that, if you subclass navigation controller, and you do not implement the init with nib and bundle, it will crash with that exception, saying that, oh, okay, you don't implement that, which is so weird and ridiculous that I guess they patched it up later in like iOS 13, because it doesn't happen on iOS 13 and any other version, to be honest, only 12 to 12.5, 11 to 12.5. And basically the fix for this was just to override that init with nib name, and then call super.init with nib name and pass the params, and that's it. That would fix it, and it was easily reproducible in simulator, right? It would crash immediately. And yeah, that fixes it and still works fine on iOS 13 and 14, and fixes it for 11 and 12. And and then I made a hotfix for this. And I think now it's been a day or two after a day and a half now after this. And seems like there are no crashes, and it's end of this saga. But yeah, that's just a little interesting tidbit that kind of happened. And I didn't expect neither of those things to happen, actually. But takeaways from this, guys: don't mess with frames if you have auto layout constraints. Just work with the constraints. Maintain your libraries if you can. I wouldn't say rely on Apple stuff more than on third-party libraries. I'm actually not a fan of that concept. I think third-party libraries are a great benefit and leverage that you can utilize to move faster and even kind of have more reliable code base, if you will, if you don't have enough resources, which is a lot of us iOS developers. We're in small teams or smaller teams, and we don't have resource constrained, and we don't have enough time to implement our own thing, right? And apparently, another reason for that, Apple's stuff is quite often subpar, as I keep saying. I mean, they're not gods. They make mistakes too, and they sometimes just don't even prioritize some of the features that we care about. So they just don't do a good of a job implementing them. And then another takeaway: not even unit tests, but integration test, UI test your stuff on multiple OS versions. This is a big lesson for me. I think I'll invest in. We have unit tests in our code base. We don't have that many UI tests. I think they're all outdated. And it's again same thing. It takes time to maintain them. I don't think we have the resources. But what I'll try to do now, I'll try to actually invest in smoke tests and basically have like a couple of UI tests that just launch the app and click around to load screens. And I will be running them against at least 3 versions back now, I guess. The current version and maybe 2 or 3 back of the OS to see if anything crashes or something like that happens again. So yeah, guys, that's it for today. That was my saga of bug hunting and bug crushing. And I will see you next time. You can reach me at hello@InsideIOSDev via email or tweet at me at InsideIOSDev. And I'll see you next time. Bye.